Thank you.
Daniella and I live in Jerusalem, and we commute to Beersheba to teach. And we had the privilege over the past, 3-4 years to discuss the exact topic of this session more than once, sharing and comparing notes. I should say I'm a professor of Jewish history. I focus on medieval Jewish history and the issue of scriptures as devotional objects and how they function within the Jewish religious space and within the Jewish religious culture is something that is of extreme interest to me. So we compared notes over this commute to Beersheba and from Beersheba, and I saw how Daniella's book about the importance of the sacred objects, not only the objects but time and space in Islamic culture, kind of crystallized and materialized. So I must say that I'm really looking forward to this panel. Our first speaker is Annelise Koloska. Annelise is a scholar of Arabic and Islamic studies, focusing on the Qur'an, Islamic exegesis, and early Islamic visual culture. She's a senior lecturer at the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She earned her PhD in Arabic studies from the Freie Universität in Berlin. She has been a fellow of the Martin Buber Society of Fellows, the very luxurious Martin Buber Society of Fellows at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem from 2016 to 2020. And before, she held a research position at the Collaborative Research Center 626, Aesthetics, Experience, and the Disillusion of Artistic Limits at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and the Corpus Qur'anicum project at the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities in Potsdam. Starting in October of 2021, she will be the PI, the principal investigator of an ERC project, Visionis. It is going to investigate the conjunction between literature and material culture, and will examine how discourses, practices, and artifacts connected to vision, sight, and seeing have been conceptualized and calibrated in a variety of early Muslim environments. And I very much look forward to this project because it is of extreme interest to me as well. I wrote about some of this from the Jewish point of view. So Annelise, the floor is yours. The topic of Annelise's lecture is Encountering Ritual Objects and the Interpretation of the Quran. So Annelise, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Ephraim. And we definitely shall talk about visions and visuality. And thank you, Yoni. Thank you, Daniella, for inviting me for organizing this conference and giving me actually the reason to engage into with a topic I didn't have given much thought about before. And here you will get now the first more questions than answers about encountering ritual objects and interpretation of the Quran. A minute.
Annelise, I would just want to make one last comment. Every speaker has 20 minutes, so I'm going to be kind of punctual about time. So please.
I measured, it shouldn't be more than 18 minutes. I wish I'll keep. Right. So actually, I guess it's somehow self-evident that the Quran as a holy scripture of Islam has had an impact and has an impact on Muslim ritual life, being also a ritual object in itself, or having influences or effects on ritual objects. But what if we change the question? What if you're not asking about the Quran's effect on material culture and ritual practices, but what is actually the material culture of and in the Quranic text itself? So are there references to material objects, and in our context to ritual objects? So to objects that provide like cognitive or spiritual, but also practical support in daily life, like protection, empowerment, and anything like that. Objects that are kind of tools in religious practices or for certain kinds of performances, and things or objects that are under the sovereignty of humans. So I have to say, not much research has been conducted on this topic, on the topic of material culture. Until now, the dissertation of Eleonore Häuptner, a student of Rudi Paret from 1966, which is now more than 50 years ago, is presently still the only sustained engagement with material culture of the Quran. This is largely actually a catalog of references to material culture. She lists all kinds of items from textiles, garments, coins, weights, and gives some more information about their usage. Her work, however, assumes a simple correspondence between textual realities and the social, historical, and cultural context in which the Quran emerged in the 7th century. Now, given that the Quran is a literary and theological text, highly rhetorical, often elusive, scarcely descriptive, I think we can't draw any precise picture of the socio-historical culture without taking into account the literary and theological character of the text. So that means material culture is already mediated and changed into interpreted objects. So the Quran as source for our knowledge of its historical material context is hence quite tricky. And it gets even trickier and more complex if we take this exploration one step further and ask about ritual objects. So I found myself in front of a lot of questions, and I told you before, this lecture or this talk will be more about questions than answers. And I give you some headlines now of the questions I asked myself. So how do I distinguish a reference to a ritual object from an object without further ritual or religious function? Assuming I found a reference to a ritual object, so what used to be its function, its meaning, how it was shaped, maybe is there anything to know about its way to be manufactured, about its way to be sacralized? The Quran actually gives hardly any hint. Do actually ritual objects change their meaning and function in the Quran? What is the horizon of understanding of the first listeners? So what's the possible understanding in the historical context of objects? Do we have maybe later interpretations and traditions that hint at the ritual meaning of an object in the Quran I am not aware of? Or do we have references to objects in the Quran without a ritual function in its historical context, but they are becoming part of ritual practices in later Muslim traditions? So lots of questions. In the following, I would like to show you some preliminary and not comprehensive chart that I established according to these initial questions. Looks a little bit like that. There will be objects that they have a ritual function, maybe they have now, maybe that they de-ritualized. There part of them were probably considered ritual, but without having an actual ritual function, or maybe some lost their meaning as ritual objects. And I also started to establish groups of objects according to their appearance in certain speech genres, or as I wrote it here, text types. So I assume that there's a difference between the reference of to an object in a narrative, or let's say a polemic section or a legal passage. Presumably, an object referred to in a verse that provides provisions, for example, for sacrifice or sacrificial acts, has a stronger relation to historical, cultural, and religious context. Whereas, for example, an object that has a ritual function in a narrative might not be considered of importance for ritual practices of the audience. So the function and meaning of certain objects may or may not appear different according to the text types. But these are all preliminary ideas and suggestions. So I'll show you now 5 groups of objects, and I'll dwell in each group on one object in particular. So the first objects are objects in direct speech, meaning a speech that is directed to the audience, a historical audience. And these objects are used in sacrificial practices and worship. And maybe you're not very astonished to find several kinds of sacrificial animals here. Some as keep the function as sacrificial animals, Hadi, for example, or the called Buddhan, and others lose it. And they're also named Bahira, if you can see it down, Sa'iba, Wasila, and Ham. Now, I stumbled about one term. It's called Qala'id, garlands. Appears 2 times. It says, God has made the Kaaba, the sacred house, a means of sustentation for mankind, and also the sacred months, the offerings, and the garlands. So, al-Qala'id. What does that mean? So we know about Hadi that are these kind of animals, but what is Qala'id? According to exegetes and grammarians, it refers to something that is put upon the neck of a camel or a cow that is brought as offerings to Mecca for sacrifice. It can also denote a sacrificial animal in itself, so then it's a kind of metonymy. These animals thus bear a sign or a clear mark showing that they're meant to be sacrificed and they can't be touched, so they're kind of sacralized. At-Tabari, a 10th century Muslim exegete, quotes other traditions according to which pilgrims in pre-Islamic times used bark of the trees of Mecca. In some traditions, it's even said tamarind bark, liha samur, as necklaces when they performed the pilgrimage, or even when they went home from the Hajj in order to be protected. So these necklaces obviously had an apotropic function. And in the case of animals, these garlands, these qala'id, sacralized them. However, as you see, we are not informed of anything, not their form, their size, their exact function. And these passages actually just open questions about the way the pilgrimage may have been performed in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And I want to just mention one thing. So the pictures that I'm showing are just a simple visualizations. They shall trigger your attention and your interest, but they do not resemble any kind of these objects I'm talking about. So we do have other objects in direct speech, but their function appears more in more divinatory or magic. For example, aslam, kind of arrows, they were thought to reveal what was allotted to somebody. Or blowing on knots, uqad, in textiles was obviously something to use to harm somebody else. I came about one case, about the case of ta'ir. That means bird, or it means omen. It says here, we have attached every one person's omen to his neck. At-ta'ira fi unqihi. And I would like, and I started asking, I would like to pose a question. Do we have here now an already known literary expression? Or is it maybe a takeover of magic practices into the sphere of prophetic speech? We know that ornithomancy was practiced in Arabia. That means the observation of bird flights as means to deduce the fate or the omen of people by reading and interpreting the actions of the birds, where they're coming from light, right or left, and so on. And some Muslim exegetes also explain or refer to these practices when they're talking about these verses. So, this verse. So did people maybe have some kind of bird skulls, bones, anything kind of talisman hanging around the necks, implicating their hope for good fate? And is this kind of superstition now suspended in the Quran and changed into a mere metaphorical device? Does it say now God is the one, not the soothsayer, not anyone doing magic, who hangs the omen, the bird, around the necks? another kind of objects. Objects in direct speech, but in oath. So some Quranic surahs start with introductory oath. And here we find in Surah 95, the swearing by the fig tree and the olive tree. So by the fig tree and the olive tree, by Mount Sinai, by the secure town. In Muslim interpretation, they are usually interpreted as examples of God's nourishment for mankind, or as metonymy. So they substitute the name of a place, and the trees thus represent places usually identified with places in the Holy Land. And also Western scholars tend and like to follow this interpretation. So they point out that both trees, the olive tree as well as the fig tree, are not indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula. And in this respect, they present not only the creation theme, but they symbolize the central settings of earlier divine revelations. The Holy Land, which is now enlarged and includes Mecca. So actually, this interpretation makes a lot of sense, especially if we've seen by Mount Sinai and the secure town, which is then Mecca. But still, I would like to ask whether the meaning of the trees go beyond metonyms and go beyond symbolism, and they may have had ritual functions. Since an oath is calling upon religious important phenomena as witness, could maybe the fig and the olive tree have had certain religious meaning and function? Trees, as we know, have been objects of veneration and worship, usually associated with female deities, but also because of certain religion traditions or mysteries connected to them. So the fig tree connected to the tree in paradise, or we have actually in the later very famous light verse, the Ayat an-Nur in the Qur'an, it says the following: His, God's light, is like this. There's a niche, and in it is a lamp, and the lamp inside a glass like a glittering star, fueled from a blessed olive tree from neither east nor west. So swearing by these trees might implicate the transfer of recreational powers of the deities to the one God, or they might refer to these religious mysteries. Other ritual objects that I could not really figure into a bigger group: the cloak and the lamp. So the opening passages of Surah 33 and 34 address the Quranic messenger, Muhammad himself. In 73, the messenger is ordered to rise and pray during the night. So, O you enwrapped in your mantle, Muzammil, stand vigils through the night except a little. And in 74, he's asked to raise and warn. O you shrouded in your mantle, raise up and warn. So leaving aside now Muslim traditions connected to these verses that go in a quite different direction, I would like to ask whether the indirect mentioning of a kind of cloak, so it's not really meant cloak. Mudassir is somebody who is shrouded in something, and Muzammil something, enwrapped in something. I would like to ask whether this kind of cloak refers to garment dressed for ritual of praying or proclaiming. Recent Quranic scholarship showed the strong bounds between the early Quranic proclamations, which these surahs are part of, with the theology and religious life of Christian ascetics. Holy men were often associated with cloaks and mantles. Their honorific mantles were passed by to students and followers, thus transferring authority to them. The most well-known, actually biblical precedent is the miraculous mantle handed down by Elijah to Elisha in the moment before the former ascension to heaven, and thus he transfers the power to Elisha. And we do have several recounts of the distribution of garments in circles of Christian ascetics. One example, and it was very striking, is the life of Antony from the mid-4th century, where the author Athanasius recounts how Antony a desert father in Egypt, had bequeathed his clothing as his legacy to his spiritual students, and he says, distribute my clothing. To Bishop Athanasius, give the one sheepskin and the cloak on which I lie, and to Bishop Serapion, give the other sheepskin, and you keep the hair garment. And each of those who received the blessed Anthony's sheepskin and the cloak worn out by him keeps it safe like some great treasure. For even seeing these is like beholding Anthony, and wearing them is like bearing his admonitions with joy. Thus, the garments and cloaks become religious and devotional objects. So is it possible to draw connections between those practices and the two Quranic references? Last group, the ritual objects and narratives. And as you see, I said selection, it's not all. There are quite a few more. As you can see, we have this quite big number of objects that implicate a certain ritual function. However, each case is different. It might be a ritual function in the narrative itself. For example, the shirt of Joseph. The shirt of Joseph helps his father to regain his sight when it was put on his eyes. Moses uses his staff as a kind of wand to compete with the magicians of Pharaoh. Lots are used to choose the guardian of Mary. These objects are inherent parts of the narratives, which recount biblical or parabiblical traditions, but they do not say anything about their usage in the time of the proclamation of the Quran. Other objects actually lose their ritual function. The table which Jesus shall bring down from heaven for his disciples, this is recounted in Surat al-Ma'idah and 5, can be argued to be the table of the agape meal, of the Eucharist, so the center of Christian faith, which is now de-ritualized in the Quran and represents simply a means of divine grace and nourishment. In the Quran, we have even at several times the recounting of the post-biblical story of Abraham smashing the idols of his people, the so-called Asnam. And the story is generally seen as reflecting the situation of the Prophet Muhammad among his people. So it's read typologically. In this case, we might argue that there's maybe a congruency between the objects in the narrative and contemporary ritual objects. And last but not least, a whole lecture can be filled with a religious meaning of the palm tree, where Mary is giving birth to Jesus. The palm tree as a dwelling place of female deities, as a holy tree. There are stories and rituals connected to it, and thus we can assume that there's maybe an appropriation and reinterpretation of these meanings and functions in the Quranic narrative. I hope these examples showed you now actually already the complexity that one faces when dealing with ritual objects in the Quran, but it shall and the unrecovered treasury we do have here. The Quran draws on common knowledge, imagery, and cultural practices shared by the audience, but it does not simply depict or reproduce meanings and functions of these objects. The objects are part of processes of adaptation, transformation, and also reinterpretation. And we still have much more to understand about it and to explore. And here, actually, I already want to thank you for your attention. And another question, which I would like to hand over to my colleagues that are coming. We do have another oath starting in Surat 68. It says, "Wal qalam wal ma yasturun," by the pen, noon by the pen and what they write. Now, again, this can have a very symbolic and metaphorical meaning, but what about the possibility that this oath ritualizes a common object? Or is this pen already a ritual object and I simply have no clue about it? Please use your pens, share your ideas. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Annelise, and thank you for also being prompt with the time. We'll move to our, please also stop sharing your screen so that Stefan can also share a screen with us. Our next speaker is Professor Stefan Heidemann. He's a professor from Hamburg University and the leading scholar of Islamic studies whose work encompasses the study of literary and legal sources, material culture, numismatics, and archaeological evidence. He focuses mainly on periods of transition and economic and cultural change in Islamic societies. Most prominent among his studies figure the formation of the early Islamic empire, the apogee of the Abbasid Empire, and the formation of the Middle Islamic civilization in the 12th and 13th centuries. He has worked with archaeological missions from Portugal to Syria and Mongolia, I should say far and wide, and he has published extensively and widely. Among his monographs, his first monograph from 1994, Das Alpiner Kalifat from 1261, vom Untergang des Kalifats in Baghdad über Aleppo zu der Restauration in Cairo, that came out in 94. Oh, sorry, that came out in 2002, and Die Renaissance der Städte in Nordsyrien und Nordmesopotamien, about the cities of Raqqa and Haran during the Bedouin, from the Bedouin time to the Seljuki Empire. His most recent publication is Regional History of Coin Finds from Ashur, dating from the Achaemenids to the 19th century. And the title of his talk today is, and excuse my Arabic, Surat al-Ikhlas, al-Fatiha, or Ayat al-Kursi, which one has precedence in early Islamic amulets, coins, and tombstones? So Stefan, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much for this kind introduction. And I'd like to express my thanks to Yoni and Daniella to bring us together today on this quite exciting topic on the crossroads between literary studies and material culture. So my interest in the Surat al-Ikhlas and the Fatiha and the Ayat al-Kursi and its application and position in the material culture was inspired by several research projects. First of all, I was fascinated and inspired by Angelika Neuwirth's seminal book of 2012, which was translated into English in 2019, the Qur'an and late antiquity, a shared heritage. But the English title downplays its more programmatic German title, the Quran as late antique text. She identifies the Quran mainly as a liturgical text which answers to the spiritual intellectual debates of the Jewish Christian environment at the time. The revelation was an active part in a discursive process. The Quran and Muhammad did not address people who were already Muslims, but followers, listeners, and not yet believers. The message had to resonate with their often sophisticated Christian and Jewish beliefs. The divine wonder and sign of God was appropriate at this time. It was the aesthetical, unsurpassed, poetic Arabic language of the Quran in which Muhammad delivered God's words. Positioned into late antique context of discourses among the Christian and Jewish disputes, Angelika Neuwirth was able to reposition the surahs into these larger discourses. Other sources of inspiration for this talk are the studies, especially with Quranic verses on material culture by Robert Hillenbrand, who worked on Quranic epigraphy in medieval Islamic architecture, and Luke Treadwell's article on Quranic inscription on coins of the Ahl al-Bayt. And finally, I want to mention Sarah Kian Arad, who wrote on amulets in Islamic Iran. but here she focuses much less on the material culture than of its literary traces. I concentrate here on the Surat al-Ikhlas in relation to the Fatiha and the Ayat al-Kursi. The sources for the study are here mainly coins and metal amulets. Metal is what has survived best from the early Islamic period, only to be rivaled by stone. Metal amulets seem to have in general a more protective purpose, while the surviving paper and parchment talismans can be much more specific in the selection of the surat for treatment of an ailment or to enhance the fulfillment of a wish, such as fertility. Most of the early magical stones are inscribed with linear Kufic, which is intentionally unintelligible for the uninitiated. Only very few have legible Quranic inscriptions. Surprisingly, individually carved stone amulets are in this regard more akin to paper and parchment. Metal talisman answer more to everyday's need for protection and can be mechanically reproduced for the most part and are part of the everyday life. The paper will answer the question of the purpose of the surahs in everyday life. I was surprised how clear the answer is when we divided the group between more customized paper parchment and to a certain extent stones, amulets, from the serially produced coins and metal amulets for protective purposes. The reason to study both coins and amulets at the same time lies in the fact that coins can serve as amulets. I excluded tombstones and other inscriptions which are in the title because this opens a very different context and questions. Arad started already to work on the literature known as Khawas al-Ayat, the special abilities of the Quranic verses. The genre is known, but only few manuscripts are edited yet. This literature has yet to be included into the full study. I will first present the surats under study, then their use on coinages, and then look at amulets. And finally, I will come to a conclusion. In regard to the Surat al-Ikhlas, Neuwirth emphasizes its liturgical role as a Quranic profession of faith. She translates Ikhlas, the pure faith, and compares it with other current creeds of faith. She reads the first verse, Qul Allahu Ahadun, as a mirror to the Shema Yisrael, and as being more affirmative with a stronger Qul, speak, instead of Shema, which means hear. She proves this relation with the intertextuality of the ungrammatical use of Ahad in Arabic instead of the grammatically correct Wahid. This is a reference to the Echad of the Jewish prayer. The rest of the Ikhlas answers almost verbatim to the Byzantine Greek Nicene Creed in acknowledging the absolute God and with a final rebuff of the father and son relation of God in Christianity. The Ikhlas is a powerful statement. What consequences this new interpretation might have, we will see later. The Fatiha is an equally powerful text. Neuwirth identifies without much surprise the text as an intended and practiced communal prayer, much in the venue of the function of the Christian Our Father, with which it shares certain structural characteristics. And the third one, the Ayat al-Kursi. The Ayat al-Kursi derives its power from its most elevated praise of the exalted God in the Qur'an. The use of the surat on coins is not without merit for the understanding of the Ikhlas in popular practice. Often coins or coin-like objects are used as protective amulets. The most prominent material use of the Surat al-Ikhlas in the early Islamic Empire was on the coins of the coinage reform by Abdul Malik and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf at the end of the 7th century. In a previous article, I had argued that the epigraphic coinage of Abd al-Malik is new in the language, Arabic, and its design elements, but not new in the semantics of Hellenistic coin design. I do not want to repeat the argument, just the bottom line. Coins in the Hellenistic venue had on one side a portrait of the emperor, the king, or the sovereign, and on the other side a religious symbol, a god, and an allegory, a cross, or the fire altar. After the defeat of the Zubayrid Caliphate, Abd al-Malik embraced the propaganda La hukm illa Allah, no sovereignty but God's, not literally but in practice. He removed himself and any of the following Islamic emperors from the side of the sovereign and replaced it with the symbol of God's sovereignty, his words. This was a creative solution to the problem how to depict sovereignty of an unimaginable, thus undepictable God. The religious symbol on the reverse was substituted by the profession of faith, the Shahada. Similarly to Sasanian coinage, mint and date was added to the silver coins. What I was not aware at the time I wrote the article was Neuwirth's research, which positioned the Ikhlas at the center of the faith, comparable to the Shema Yisrael and the Nicene Creed. This in mind, it makes the choice of the Ikhlas even more powerful in praising the unity and omnipotence of God with an intertextual relation to the Christian and Jewish creed. As a quintessential creed for the Islamization, it remained also part of the coins of the Kharijites and Alid rebels against the Umayyads. They were just adding further Quranic phrases at the margins. The Abbasids relinquished the surah of the pure faith and replaced it with the redundant Muhammad Rasulullah, which is also found in the inscription in the margin. We know from al-Balazuri and early Hadith collections that there were criticism against the use of the Quran for the profane purpose of coins, where everybody could touch them and even desecrate them. Bacharach and Treadwell studied these reactions of religious scholars. At late thought, al-Makrizi echoed this criticism with the answer of Abd al-Malik to a scholar who raised objections. Do you wish other nations to allege against us that we have erased our belief in the unity of God and the name of the Prophet? The Muhaddisun made their peace with the existence of coins with Quranic verses. They advised that touching them should only be done after ritual ablution, and this goes back to our first speaker, and should not be touched by impure persons, even menstruating women. Surely it helped the proliferation of the Quranic coins that the majority of the population were neither Muslim nor religious scholars, but Christians, Zoroastrian, and Jews, which saw primarily for what they were means of payment. After the Umayyads, we find occurrences of the Surat al-Ikhlas occasionally in certain years among regular series for coin circulation, especially during the 10th and 11th century. We find them among such diverse series of the Buyids, Samanids, Kakuyids, Banijurids, Seljuks, Ghaznavids, and even the Karmatids issued coins with the Surat al-Ikhlas in Oman. But these were in each case exceptions from a accustomed sequence of coins at the mint. Secondly, it is also found occasionally on specially designed presentation coins for ceremonial purposes. On the screen, a presentation coin of the Buyid Vizier Sahib ibn Abad with the Surat al-Ikhlas. Some of the issues clearly are imitating Umayyad dirhams, probably as reminder of the restoration of the good old monies in times of debasement. These occurrences have to be analyzed separately in each historic case. The Fatiha, as a standard ritual prayer, does not occur on regular coinages as far as I know. It is understandable because it is not a statement of Islam as al-Ikhlas, it is a personal prayer. We only find the Fatiha until now on special issue donative coins. The ceremonial reasons for these issues were manifold. Circumcisions, weddings, Nowruz, Eid al-Fitr, Mehragans, and others. Lutz Illich had assembled all references in the literary sources available to him on presentation coins for such occasions. As a prayer, these coins have a place in the ceremonies at special occasions. On the screen, a presentation coin from Madinati Salam 474 from the time of Malik Shah, with the Fatiha and the Ayat al-Kursi. It was talisman-like, and the piercing seems to confirm that the contemporary wore these coins as a protective amulet. The Ayat al-Kursi occurs only on regular issues on coins of the great Seljuks from Malik Shah to Sanjar, but not in any other period. Its significance is the praise of the absolute God. The three surahs on amulets. The Surat al-Ikhlas has also a prominent place on early Islamic amulets. I will be argued that the Surat al-Ikhlas as a protective device might have some relation to Sulaiman, the king of the demons in material culture. Sarah Kianrad authored recently an article about the continuation of citation Sasanian amulet practices and their survival in Islamic Iran and beyond, based on an example from the photo files on coins and coin-like objects at the University of Hamburg. She argued that the roots of the Islamic talismanic and magical practices go far beyond the Sasanian Iran, which had a rich talismanic culture. The cultural transfer to the Islamic period is not at all surprising, since most of the population had their Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian heritage in all of the different sectarian denomination and regional varieties. There are only few studies about Sasanian magical objects. The exception is Rika Gieselin's study on Sasanian magical seals. While Kianrad concentrated in her article on iconography, I focus more on the Quranic text. The Hamburg Talisman shows on the iconographical side a figure which is well known in the Sasanian talismanic tradition. In the center there is a figure with disheveled hair, standing and bound between two staffs. These are staves, which are the objects on the bottom left and right of the figure. It doesn't look here like staffs, but if you know from where it comes, it has a resemblance. The standing figure dates the amulet into the 8th and 9th centuries. Although it is not obvious, on this specimen we have a number of Sasanian parallels which he could show. Magical objects in these venues are about binding and sealing the demons, deeps, and the framing line around the image is important because it imprisons the demon. The amulet stands at the beginning of Islamic amulet practices. The important transcultural aspect on the object is that its Sasanian iconography is associated at this early point with the powerful Surat al-Ikhlas. Soon after Kianrad published her article, I came across another of this object. It was not a lone limb. It emphasizes the findings of Kianrad. It shows again a disheveled Div standing in a Sasanian fashion. The Div is now imprisoned by a verse from the Surat al-Baqarah. It is the first, so God will protect you from them, good through God. The words of the verse about God's protection is formed almost like an arch, which is suggesting a prayer niche as prison for the demon. The reverse shows again the very powerful Surat al-Ikhlas. Kianrad analyzes the iconography and its development and supposes that the standing disheveled Div morphs over time into the sitting, cross-legged king of the demons, Sulaiman, and in the development of this talisman. Sulaiman binds the demons. Sulaiman, in its ability to reign the Divs, is mentioned and legitimized by 3 Quranic verses. However, as a caveat, explicit textual reference to Sulaiman on early Islamic amulets are unknown to Kianrad's knowledge. But the idea of magical binding and sealing was transferred from the Sasanians to Islam. Over the time, the binding and sealing of the king of the demons, Sulaiman, became synonymous with the khatam, the seal in the form of the hexagram. The power of Sulaiman is often depicted on objects by a hexagram. The Hungarian scholar Alexander Fodor found on a 19th century amulet from Cairo that the Ikhlas was also called khatam. Although this is a late incident and many missing links are in this line between the finding of Kianrad and the findings of Fodor in the 19th century, we can probably add some dots in between for the relation by looking at other amulets from the first centuries of Islam. On lead amulets, probably from the Iberian Peninsula, we have a group of talismans which combines the khatam of Sulaiman and the Surat al-Ikhlas, as you see on the screen. From the Iberian Peninsula, a large group of leaden amulet containers are known, which presumably belong to the same period, that means the 10th to the 15th century, or 13th century. Most of them have the Surat al-Ikhlas as a protective spell. Some have also, not on the screen, just al-Mulk as a protective. The protective abilities of the Ikhlas is also found on coin amulets in the East. The amulet character of these coins is apparent because they were mounted or significantly pierced to serve as pendant talismans, which is clear that the Surat al-Ikhlas is made by the loop. And here a second one where the loop is removed. A probably Buyid period group of amulets shows the Ikhlas around a horseman with a falcon. This one is produced with 2 hollow bracteate sheets of silver which were matched together. It is
Stefan,
also part of large...
May I interrupt you just for a moment? You're a bit over the time, so if you either want to condense it a bit or abbreviate a bit.
I'm quite at the end, so
okay.
It's not.
Okay. Sorry.
So the Falcon Rider is part of a group which connects part of a group of amulets which connects the Surat al-Ikhlas with the Falcon Rider. Generally, the Falcon Rider is an Iranian and Transoxanian motif, but it may have here hidden connections to the protective abilities of the Ikhlas. And given this connection, I may speculate that a further group of medallions without any inscriptions with the Falcon Rider and a sit-in figure with attendants might be connected with this group. They might be investigated more as a depiction of Sulaiman, the king of the demons, rather than a generic Buyid ruler. And of this type there are more, not in my presentation. In comparison, what is the use of the other 2 mentioned significant ayat? First the Fatiha and then the Kursi. The Fatiha appears on amulet, but it is rare. On the screen, one of the earliest examples. It is a bronze amulet, probably produced in the 11th, 13th century in Khurasan. However, the Ikhlas and the Fatiha appear here combined. In the center is the Ikhlas, and in the margin we find the Fatiha prayer. On the reverse is a magical incised inscription in linear Kufic, unintelligible for the uninitiated. The center is blurred, but it seems to depict a feline attacking another animal, as we have it often on incantations bowls. The Fatiha, here on a presentation coin were used on amulets in a similar pattern. I can show you only amulets, the one which I showed before, because I don't know of any other for the early Islamic period. It is from Madinah to Salam and combined two surahs. Later, after 1500, the Ayat al-Kursi becomes much more popular for the Zar cult in Egypt at the end of the 19th century, where the Surat al-Kursi has a monopole. So these are from the Zar cult. And now conclusion. The contextualization of Angelika Neuwirth of the Surat al-Ikhlas emphasizes the importance of the Islamic Ikhlas, the pure faith, even more than it is apparent from the Islamic context alone. The choice of the Ikhlas on coins by Abdul Malik and al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is apparent as a symbol of Islamic dominance over Judaism and Christianity in emphasizing the sovereignty of God. It made the Ikhlas an extremely powerful statement far beyond the political realm. In post-Umayyad periods, the Ikhlas is the most frequent used Quranic verse, apart from the standard Quranic inscriptions on coins. The Ayat al-Kursi only appears occasionally on coins in the Great Seljuk period. The prayer of the Fatiha seems to be reserved only for formal ceremonial presentation coins. The Ikhlas is without any doubt the most prolific Quranic inscription on early Islamic amulets according to the material at hand. The view is clouded in the literature, which often lumps together amulets of all periods and excluded coin amulets altogether. Kianrad establishes connection with the binding and sealing and imprisoning of demons on Sasanian amulets. The iconography of the bound and imprisoned Div is culturally transferred to Sulaiman and his role of binding and sealing of demons. It seems that the association of the Ikhlas and Sulaiman continues in the material culture. Some additional data for that here was added. However, there is no literary text about this connection. Early Islamic metal amulets can have the Ayat al-Kursi, but in the known cases, it occurs only in conjunction with the Ikhlas. The Ayat al-Kursi is a sole inscription on amulets, is only to be found later after 1500. It is the Ikhlas is the foremost and prevalent ayat in the early Islamic period, and the Fatiha may have retained its role as ritual prayer and appears on some amulets in conjunction with other ayats. This makes the Ikhlas to the preeminent apocryphal Quranic surah in the early Islamic world. Thank you for your attention. And sorry that I'm a little bit over the time.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And we're moving quickly to our next speaker. The first two speakers came from the Islamic realm. Our next speaker, Dotan Arad, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry in Bar-Ilan University, comes from the realm of Judaism. He's the head of the Oded and Tony Eliashar Center for the Study of Sephardi Jews in the Land of Israel. Dr. Arad received his PhD in Jewish history from the Hebrew University. His research focuses on Jews in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine during the Mamluk and early Ottoman period. Between 2012 and 2014, he published with a few colleagues a series of volumes containing response to literature from fragments of Jewish sages in the Ottoman Empire that emanated from the Cairo Geniza. His new book with Dr. Miriam Wagner from Cambridge University is titled Wisdom and Greatness in One Place, the Alexandrian trader Moshe ben Yehuda and his circle, and it will be published soon with the Geniza Studies series by Brill. And his current research project deals with Karaites in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt during the Ottoman period. The title of his lecture is real scrolls, imagined scrolls, sacred manuscripts, and the veneration of scribes among Jews under the Ayyubids and Mamluks. Please, Dotan.
Okay, do you hear me? Okay.
Super.
No, thank you, Effie. I think I'll simply start. Okay. Since ancient times, Jewish society regarded the tombs of biblical figures as holy. Sites such as the tomb of Samuel in Nebi Samuel, north of Jerusalem, the tomb of Rachel near Bethlehem, the tomb of the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, were well-known pilgrimage sites in Jewish society. However, not all holy sites linked to biblical figures were tombs. Several holy sites associated with two figures in the Bible, Elijah and Ezra, developed throughout the Middle East and were referred to as Knesset or Bet Knesset, but usually Knesset, a synagogue. These sites were not regarded as the place of burial, but rather as holy sites associated with their persons in which miracles continued to take place. The phenomenon of Knesiot Eliyahu, the Elijah Synagogues, was discussed by Elchanan Reiner. And I think that the reason why Elijah especially is connected with so many places around the Middle East is very clear. Elijah, according to the common Jewish faith, is still alive and can appear everywhere. But more surprising, and this is a subject I want to focus today, is the significant number of sites dedicated to another biblical figure, Ezra the scribe. An anonymous Jewish traveler writes in the second half of the 13th century that in Ludkia or Latakia, in the Arabic name, there are two fine synagogues, one of Elijah and the second of Ezra. Another traveler, which is maybe close to your heart, Effie Ptachia of Ratisbon, described two synagogues devoted to Ezra in Nusaybin, Nisibis, near the Turkish-Syrian border, and says, in one of them is a red stone fixed in the wall, which Ezra had brought with him, and which had been one of the stones of the temple. And this very strange tradition, because again, we can ask, what pushed Ezra to leave Jerusalem after the rehabilitation of the temple and the city and come in order to establish a new synagogue in northern Syria? It's very strange. And it goes on. In addition to Latakia and Nusaybin, there were two Ezra synagogues in Tedef. Near, there were also in Diyarbakir and Ahmediyya in Kurdistan. Unlike Elijah, the tomb of Ezra is known in Jewish tradition and located near Basra on the Tigris River. So why, I want to ask, why therefore did the medieval Jews identify so many places as the synagogues of Ezra? In order to answer it, let us read now a description of the Ezra synagogue in Tedef, which was written by Yitzhak ibn el-Farah, a Spanish Jewish traveler who visited the site in 1441. At a distance of 2 days from Aleppo, there is Ezra the scribe's tomb, where Ezra wrote the Torah scroll. The remains of the oil are still viewable on the candle he used in his writing. The main characteristic of Ezra is his activities as a scribe. He is the first known figure, except of course of Moses himself, who copied a scroll of the Torah. Rabbinic literature ascribes fixed attributes to biblical figures, such Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, Rachel Imenu, Joseph the righteous, Yosef HaTzadik, Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, Rachav Azona, Rachav the prostitute, Bilam HaRasha, Balaam the wicked. And Ezra always appears in rabbinic literature as Ezra the scribe. Although, for example, he could have also been referred to as Ezra the priest, because in the book of Ezra, he described as a priest. It is important to emphasize that the collocation Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe, is not common in canonical sources like the Mishnah and the Talmud, but it is very common in medieval texts like, Maimonides, Nachmanides, Rashi, etc. So we can say that we are speaking on, so I want to say it's a medieval concept, okay, to speak about Ezra HaSofer. The traditions and folklore around the figure of Ezra may contribute us in understanding some characters of the usage of ritual objects in Jewish society. Many Middle Eastern Jewish communities hold very old biblical manuscripts. These manuscripts were a source of pride for the community. Such holy manuscripts were held in Damascus, Cairo, Sunbat in Egypt, and other places. For example, I mentioned Sunbat here. You can say description of the old scroll of Sunbat that later brought to Cairo. I'm sorry, I added this slide only yesterday night, so I didn't have time to translate it to English, but you can see, ונוהגים בו קדושה ביותר, מדליקים לפניו נרות לא יכבה אישה, ומביאים לו נדרים ונדבות, ומלבישים אותו בגדי משי ורקמה, וכל מי שנשבע עליו לשקר אינו משלים אותו וכולי. It's very respectful and honorable book. In some cases, the author of the old manuscript is known because he signed his name in the colophon. For example, the famous Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex was copied by Shlomo ben Buyah and was vocalized by Aaron ben Asher in the 10th century, and after a long journey, as you probably know, arrived to Aleppo, where it was kept in the Elijah cave in the synagogue. This manuscript, as is also well known, was considered by Maimonides as one of the most accurate manuscripts. As he said, that the codex was the text of which I relied in the scroll that I copied, etc. However, all manuscripts without known scribe were attributed to ancient figures. This phenomenon is known well also among the Samaritans. The Samaritans attributed the writing of their most important copy of the Torah to Avisha, the great-grandson of Aharon, Aaron the priest. Although according to many scholars, the manuscript, this manuscript was copied only in the 11th century, and the tradition, the attribution to Avisha emerged only during the 14th century. So this scroll is interesting. The scroll is kept nowadays in Mount Gerizim, near Nablus. The Jews, however, attributed some of their old manuscripts to Ezra. For example, Meshulam Volterra, the Italian Jewish traveler who arrived in Egypt in 1481, wrote that he saw in Alexandria a scroll of the law which Ezra the scribe had written with his signature, and he left it as a legacy for the synagogue of Elijah the prophet, and he enjoined a curse upon the men who should remove it from the synagogue. The scroll was kept in Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue in Alexandria. The local Jews told Meshulam that the building was built by Prophet Elijah. Unfortunately, we cannot check the manuscript. The synagogue was destroyed by French shelling in by the army of Napoleon in 1798, and the building you can see in the slide is a modern one that was built in the 19th century. A similar manuscript was kept in Fustat, Old Cairo, but this one had already disappeared in the Mamluk period, as told us by Ovadia of Bertinora. In the northeast corner is a platform where the scroll of Ezra used to be placed. It is related that many years ago, a Jew came from the west and bought it from the temple servant. He set sail from Alexandria, carrying with him the scroll of the law, but the ship was not far away from Alexandria when it sank, and he was lost, together with the roll of the law. The temple servant who had sold it to him for 100 gold pieces became an apostate and died shortly afterwards. The case of this scroll is still in the synagogue, and a light is always kept burning before it. Please pay attention how they honored the empty case, like the empty chair of Eliyahu. This is the most famous synagogue in Egypt, mainly because of the famous Geniza, a room full of manuscript in Hebrew and Arabic that was found there. The story of Ovadia regarding the old manuscript that was in it leads us to assume that the original name of it was Bet Knesset Ezra Synagogue, which was had been changed later to Ben Ezra Synagogue. There are examples for this phenomenon even from West Europe. For example, Menachem HaMeiri described such a book that was held in his community in Provence, Sefer Ezra HaNimtza Imanu. But nevertheless, most of the evidence for this phenomenon arrived from the Middle East. Unlike Elijah and Ezra, other biblical figures were regional saints. During the Ayyubid and Mamluk period, the cult of many biblical figures was concentrated in one area. For example, Rachel, I mentioned, whose tomb was identified between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, Sarah, whose tomb, as well as her ritual death she bathed in, were identified in Hebron. Prophet Ezekiel, whose tomb is identified in a village on the Euphrates River, south of Baghdad, or Prophet Nahum, which his tomb identified in northern Iraqi Kurdistan, north of Mosul. These sites served as destinations for Jews residing in cities nearby to perform ziyarah, and their cult was both a spiritual experience as well a time for leisure and recreation. The cult of biblical figures therefore represent different patterns of the appearance of sainthood in the geographic realm. The cult of most of the figures, as Samuel, Ezekiel, or Nahum, was restricted to a single site. In contrast, Ezra is the saint of designated regions, such as the North Syrian region and, to a certain extent, Egypt as well. I have not found evidence pointing to sites associated with Ezra south of Syria or Palestine. If we are checking the Muslim world, the Arabic term for the name Ezra is Uzair, although some identify him with Elazar ben Aaron, and some Muslim writers identified Uzair with Ezra. It's important, but the tomb of Uzair in Muslim traditions, some identify his tomb in Damascus. This is mentioned by Ibn Kathir, or Nablus by Yakut, or some located his tomb in Eblin in the Galilee by Nasr Hussein, or in Abu Ghosh near Jerusalem. But in any case, the traditions that locate Ezra, the tomb of Ezra, in South Syria or Palestine are not common among Jews, but only Muslim traditions. The network of sites to his image sprawls along the Turkish-Syrian and Turkish-Iraqi borders of our time, beginning with Latakia on the Mediterranean shoreline, continuing through Tadef near Aleppo, through the Diyarbakir and Nusaybin in the south of Turkey, and ending with Ahmadiyya in Iraqi Kurdistan. Unlike the local South Iraqi tradition, which commemorates Ezra by identifying his grave near Basra, this alternative tradition is not focused on a tomb, but rather a monument known as Knesset Ezra, similar to sites associated with Elijah. It is hard to determine the origin of this alternative tradition. The Bible is explicit regarding Ezra's areas of activity. He came, as we all know, he came from Babylonia, arrived to Jerusalem, and he settled in Jerusalem. So the reasons that led Ezra to transform into a local hero in North Syria and again in Egypt, Jewish communities, a region in which, as far as we know, Ezra was not active, are still unclear. But may I share with you, in the last minutes I have, some thoughts. Whereas Elijah's centrality in the popular cult of the Jews in Islamic lands during the Middle Ages reflects a longing for the covert and supernatural world, Ezra's presence in this cult reflects a yearning for the perfect text, the pure version of the Torah. Why was Ezra chosen to represent this desire? We mentioned earlier that his prominent character in rabbinic sources was that he was a scribe, but this is not the whole picture. Apparently, aside from rabbinic traditions about Ezra being an expert scribe, his figure served for negating Islamic polemic. Traces of an ancient debate between Jews and Muslims over Ezra's character can be found in various sources. Chava Lazarus Yaffe studied various positions regarding Ezra or Uzair in Islamic sources and shows how they were influenced by ancient polemical texts, particularly Samaritan ones. During the first centuries of Islam, Muslim scholars vary in their position toward Ezra. However, during the 11th century, the Andalusian scholar Ibn Hazm was extremely critical of Ezra in his writings. He portrayed him as a heretic and accused him of falsifying the Torah. This stance was further developed by Samuel al-Maghribi, who even offered a historic explanation for Ezra's forgery. According to Samuel, Ezra sought to shove the David dynasty aside and place the reins of power in the hands of the priests, because Ezra was also a priest, by inserting sections in the Torah that besmirch figures of the Davidic dynasty, such as Judah, David, Solomon, and all their sins, etc. In a world in which Jews were discounted by their Muslim neighbors for sanctifying a flawed and falsified Torah, unlike the authentic Qur'an, Jews were attracted to the concept and perhaps the reality of unblemished ancient and sacred manuscripts that represented the transmission of the accurated godly truth, who had been accused by the Samaritans and Muslims by falsifying the Torah and tampering with its wording, was precisely the one of, maybe this is one of the reasons why Ezra became a cultural hero for painstakingly preserving the words of the Torah. Thus, Ezra personified a yearning for a spotless and accurate text. History and jury pointed the sites where Ezra set and copied accurate Torah scrolls and identified ancient manuscript in their positions as manuscript he had copied himself. As opposed to Samuel, for example, or Rachel, Yosef, Joseph, Ezekiel, whose figure was tied to a particular site, and Ezra, whose figure was linked to a large, undefined geographical area, Elijah represents a character devoid of any geographical dimension, affiliation. Elijah of the Book of Kings is not restricted to a particular area. He wanders to and from and operates in a variety of areas from Lebanon, Tzarfat, Sarpeta, to Mount Sinai in the south, in the Sinai Peninsula. His transient biblical character, which comes and goes, appears one moment and disappears the next, had generated a cult that is shaped in the same fashion. Different sites throughout the Middle East are considered areas in which he appeared and resided. The cult of biblical figures among Eastern Jews in the Ayyubid, Mamluk, and even the early Ottoman periods was therefore rich and diverse, and consisted of competing perception of sanctity and different patterns for relating to the holy sphere and to the biblical honorable figures. One of them, Ezra, was shaped as a local hero who left behind him sacred manuscripts, which gained a deep honor and special attitude among the Eastern Jews. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dotan, and thank you also for being prompt with time. We're turning to our last speaker, the person who put this conference together, and we should thank her for this amazing undertaking, especially under the circumstances that this conference came about, being tampered with by COVID-19 and with the current situation. So sticking to her guns diligently. I introduce you to Professor Daniella Talmon. Professor Daniella Talmon-Heller is a professor at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. Daniella is interested in the history and the historiography of the Middle East, in religious thought and practice, and in comparative religion. She's the author of Islamic Piety in Medieval Syria from 2007 and Sacred Place and Sacred Time in the Medieval Islamic Middle East, and Historical Perspective, that came out last year in 2020. She's also the co-editor with Katja Zitrin-Silverman of the collected volume Material Evidence and Narrative Sources, Interdisciplinary Studies in the History of the Muslim Middle East, that came out in Berlin 2014, the result of a previous international workshop at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies here at BGU. Daniella will be speaking about the production of material copies of the Word of God, Jewish and Muslim prescriptions. Daniella, please. Please unmute yourself. You're muted.
Yes. After so many Zoom lectures, we still forget to do that. Thank you very much, Effie, and thank you for all the previous speakers. I've already learned a lot. And I'm also happy to see that many things that came up today will come up again in further lectures. And in a way also, I hope I'll complement some of the things we heard today, especially from Dotan most recently. Excuse me. Okay, so in a truly thought-provoking, and excuse me for using that phrase yet again, article entitled "The Iconic Book, Analogies Between the Babylonian Cult of Images and the Veneration of the Torah." Let me share this. Right. Karl von Thurn suggests a functional analogy between the Babylonian cult of divine images on the one hand and the Israelite veneration of the Torah on the other. The most interesting part of the article, which in my eyes, which has some methodological flaws too, describes how the Babylonians went about the manufacture of the image they considered a manifestation of the sacred. Van der Toren explains how they reconciled its supposedly heavenly origins with the fact of its production by human hands from earthly materials. He lists the following measures. 1, they kept the process highly secret, known only to craftsmen and priests. 2, they had the king address a prayer to the gods prior to the actual production of the image, asking their assistance, thus making it their creation, as it were. 3, the new image was made as an exact replica of the original, and therefore could be regarded as its renewal rather than replacement. Finally, when the craftsmen finished their work, the priests performed a ritual that abolished all traces of the earthly origin of the statue. He bound their hands and symbolically cut them off with a wooden sword. And then they declared that they did not produce the image. It was made by the gods. I found this ritual procedure fascinating, and it set me thinking how, if at all, Jews and Muslims produce the sanctity of the material object of the Torah and Qur'an. Likewise, cultic objects held to be of heavenly origin within the course of its making. This question is the main topic of my talk. My framework of inquiry is comparative. But in this short exposition, I do not intend to demonstrate and explain similarities and dissimilarities between Judaism and Islam in the medieval Middle East, nor to suggest mutual influences, but rather to try and decipher the very idea that artifacts manufactured by human hands are inherently holy, or become holy, or transmit holiness in both traditions. I will quickly add in my defense that as an historian interested in religious phenomena, I believe in the great significance of context. In this case, the shared space, shared language, and shared material and intellectual culture of the medieval Middle East. But I don't have the time to discuss it, especially in this talk, or religious polemics. So, of course, I would like you to think about the comparative aspects. What I'm really looking at as to capture a wide range of ideas concerning the production of a sacred object. In both traditions, perhaps it should be stressed on the onset, scriptures were employed not only for reading and study, and therefore I think it is worthwhile to speak of both of them together. They had a range of similar and dissimilar performative, talismanic, and therapeutic functions, as we've just seen, some of it. Images of the Torah and Qur'an served as symbols of divine presence, of the faith, or of the religious community. Oath and bans were sworn on copies of scripture. The mere act of bringing out the book, the closed book, at a public gathering was a ritual, meant primarily or often to invoke the protection of God and his blessings. Books were paraded at times of crisis, drought, and epidemics, and sometimes also on especially festive occasions. I could give many examples of these practices from medieval Arabic and Hebrew sources of various genres, some of them really very powerful examples, but I refrain from doing so at the moment. So let us begin with the narratives that describe the first transcription of revelation onto a material support by human hands. That is, the creation of the master copy of the Torah and the Qur'an. So I'll share my presentation again. Okay, so Dotan already mentioned actually the biblical reference to writing down the Torah by Moses. I won't read from the Bible itself, from the book of Deuteronomy, but rather from a midrash, like a creative commentary on the biblical texts, written in the late late 9th century. So we are in the medieval Middle East, and perhaps in the context of the polemics between Judaism and Islam just mentioned by Dotan, polemics regarding the authenticity of the text and the accuracy of its transmission. So whoever reads Hebrew will read for himself. I will read the translation. Moses knew that he was to die that day, so he wrote the Torah 13 times, 12 for the 12 tribes, and 1 for the Ark of the Covenant. So if anyone may wish to falsify anything, it would be found in the Ark. Right? The Torah does not mention 13 copies. It actually mentions 1 copy that was placed in the Ark of the Covenant. But again, if we think of the polemical context, the commentator has Moses prepare many copies, many accurate, authentic copies, which became the master copies for further generations. There's actually another deviation from the source, because according to Deuteronomy, the Torah will serve, this copy of the Torah will serve as a witness but not to the correct version of scriptures, as one may understand from this commentary, but rather to any incorrect behavior of the children of Israel, that is, to any deviation of the children of Israel from the actual words of the Torah. What did the original book look like? 12th century Yehuda Halevi, based on earlier sources, knows how it looked like, right? He says it was undoubtedly without vocalization and cantillation marks, that is written in scripta defectiva, like the scrolls we use today. It's correct vocalization and cantillation, and whoever knows the Hebrew alphabet and just a little bit of Hebrew knows that it is open. If the Hebrew is not vocalized, it is open to more than one, words are open to more than one reading. But Yehuda Halevi assures us that the correct reading was known since it has been transmitted orally by Moses and from generation to generation. So Yehuda Halevi imagines the original scroll of Moses to look like the scrolls known from his times. And here we have a 12th century scroll, a rare finding, written on a parchment, right? If again, anyone who, of course, those who know Hebrew letters, know, of course, that the letters are bare, and you can compare with the codex of the text with the addition of the vocalization, cantillation marks, the numbering of the verses, the commentary, and etc. All those were, according to Yehuda Halevi, absent from the original scroll. How does one copy the original scroll? Rabbi Ishmael, and here I'm using an ancient text, of course reproduced in medieval texts, writes a striking cautionary to the Jewish scribe. He said, "Be careful in your work, as it is a sacred task. Should you perchance omit or add one single letter, you would thereby destroy the whole world." And another cautionary is embodied in this short text. When one is writing the divine name, he may not respond, even if the king greets him. All his attention must be consecrated on the sanctity of the divine name. Sorry, just a minute. Okay. So, having read that, we would expect that such a dangerous encounter with the sacred would be restricted to specialists, perhaps priests, scholars, or highly professional scribes. Surprisingly, Jewish authorities assigned it to each and every Jewish male. In Sefer HaChinuch, the book of education composed in 13th century Spain, the transcription of the Torah is listed as the last commandment of Taryag Mitzvot, of the 613 commandments incumbent on every Jew. Moreover, the author claims that this was indeed practice, and I'll just highlight what I've highlighted already in purple. The anonymous author of the book quotes Maimonides, the Ramban, which we will soon encounter again, and having said, if he wrote it, meaning to say with his hand, the verse ascribed him credit as if he received it at Mount Sinai. So this is, again, I think a phrase open to various interpretations. What did Maimonides mean? Leaning on earlier texts. What is the meaning of performing this task in one's own hand? Maybe we will return to that later. But and the author of Sefer HaChinuch adds additional gains to the performance of this task, right? If everyone writes a scroll in his own hands, the scrolls proliferate among us. And each and every one of Israel can read from a new scroll, right? And even those who cannot afford to purchase one will be able to own one. And as I say, he claims that this task is indeed performed by men in every place and in all times. In chapters 7 to 10 of the Book of Love of his Code of Law, Sefer Ahava of Mishneh Torah, Maimonides explains in a very long and very technical treatise how actually to produce a Torah scroll. The treatise ends with a conveniently concise exposition of how a Torah scroll should not be written. So we will look at this shorter text rather than read the very long and technical treatise I've just mentioned. So Maimonides says the following: there are 20 factors that each in its own right can disqualify a Torah scroll. If a Torah contains one of these factors, it does not have the sanctity of a Torah scroll, but rather is considered like a Chumash, that is one of the 5 books of the Torah, used to teach children. It may not be used for public Torah reading. So it is not a ritual object in the very full or in the fullest sense of the word. How does one produce a ritual object, a ritual scroll of the Torah in the fullest sense? He should work as follows, right? And this is what one shouldn't do, and we will gather what one should do. So it should be written on a certain type of skin, or the parchment, right? And the parchment should be prepared in a certain way. It should be prepared for the express purpose of being used as a scroll of the law. Right? So you can't just use any old piece of parchment. It must be prepared ahead of time for this very purpose. And it should be a parchment, a specific parchment, right? Of the whole hide. And there's a quite detailed description of the type and the process of the preparation of the parchment. Then we have something about the preparation before the actual writing, right? The scribe must prepare the lines ahead of time, and he must use a specific kind of ink. It must be written in Hebrew, in a specific script of Hebrew. It may not be written by a heretic or other disqualified persons. And here, Rambam mentions the infidel, the convert, the woman, the minor, the slave, and the Samaritan, which may not write may not take part in the production of this ritual object. And then he demands what we've already heard, the concentration of the mind, right, of the scribe, and the accuracy of his work. Right? He may not omit or add a letter. A letter may not touch another or be marred. And we're for the very last 5 prescriptions regarding to words, sections, to the whole form of the writing, the form of the portion, and finally we're back to the material from which the scroll is produced. Looking at all those together, we can point at 5 items that refer to the use of proper materials, 3 items that refer to the identity of the scribe or the copyist and his proper intention. 12 items, unsurprisingly, refer to the accuracy and legibility of the transcriptions and to its outer appearance, right? To the dimensions of letters, lines, columns, margins, spaces, forms of paragraphs, perhaps also to the aesthetic impression of the work. Altogether, it's a daunting task, right? So Maimonides actually makes it a little bit easier upon us, right? We've read that each and every male is supposed to fulfill this commandment, but Maimonides adds, if he does not know how to write himself, he should have others write for him. Anyone who checks even a single letter of a Torah scroll is considered as if he wrote the entire scroll. Let us compare Maimonides' insistence that the Jewish copies produce an exact replica of the object of the Torah scroll, for any slightest change would compromise its unique sanctity and render it unfit for public reading, with the recommendation of the Damascene scholar An-Nawawi, who was born approximately when Maimonides died. So he's a 13th century scholar. An-Nawawi urges the Muslim copies to be precise, but also to make his work as legible and beautiful as possible. He also does not make the writing of scriptures in one's own hand an imperative. The Prophet is quoted saying just this: "Do not write anything that you hear from me, but the Qur'an. If you have written anything else, erase it." Sorry. Wait, I'm not quite here. Okay, I think yes. Before we continue with the Nawawi's text, we should say something about the perception of the preparation of the first master copy of the Qur'an. So, according to the Muslim sources, the Prophet himself did not leave a written full copy of the codex. He transmitted it orally, and his companions and wives would jot down some surahs as they heard them come along. And only 20 years after the Prophet's death and the end of his prophetic mission, the third Caliph Uthman appointed a special committee to write down the master copy of the Qur'an, so that the Muslims will have a canonized, authentic copy of the sacred book. And when they finished, early Muslim sources tell us, Uthman sent a codex in every direction, and he ordered to burn all the other leaves and copies of the Qur'an. What did that ancient manuscript, that ancient master copy, look like? Muslims point to several Muslim traditions in several places, claim to have this one of those master copies, one of the copies sent by Uthman, in their synagogues or shrines. And I've brought here one example, kept today in Tashkent. The paleographs would not date this copy to the mid 7th century. It's probably an 8th century copy, but it's an ancient copy. And this is how Muslims imagine the original master copies of the Qur'an looked like. Again, parchment, but on codex rather than scroll. And again, scripta defectiva, the letters which may be read correctly only if there is a strong oral tradition accompanying the actual reading. I will give just one example from the 12th century to see how far from the original later copies of the Qur'an were produced. So all the Muslims were not at all, after some early discussions, were not adamant on reproducing the Qur'an as an exact replica of the master copy prepared by the third caliph, right? So we have very, very different later copies, ornamented, annotated, illustrated only by calligraphy, but and geometrical and floral design. We see the numbering, the use of paper. Qur'an has changed its appearance immensely during the ages. Yet, it was regarded as a task which required meticulous training and heavenly blessing, a devotional practice, an ibadah, governed by a strict religious etiquette, demanding purity of intention, cleanliness of body and clothes, and ritual purity. Actually, being in a state of purity is required for anyone who touches the Qur'an. And here we are reminded of Brennan Wheeler's earlier discussion of things that demand purity, ritual purity before touching. As for purity of intention, some early authors were so adamant on this point that they forbade doing it for a fee, finally, better known authorities, one with a more pragmatic approach, which voiced no objection to selling the Qur'an and allowing copies to live off the work of their work of their hands. Al-Nawawi allows, or actually recommends, to write down the Qur'an in a codex, to beautify it and to make clear its writing, and to be precise in its calligraphy without writing its letters in a certain script. Scholars have recommended to include the dots and vocalize the words of the Qur'an, since this guards against errors and alterations. So all those, the innovations in script, in material, in the way of organizing the text, and now we consider it as a good innovation, which makes the text more legible and easier to read and to use in and to put to ritual use. So, neither Jews nor Muslims, let me conclude by saying that neither Jews nor Muslims explicitly claim to have received the object that carries the word of God together with the revelation. The material master copy was produced by human hands. The Jewish messenger, Moses, is accorded with the actual putting of pen to paper, if one may say so, before his death. The Muslim messenger is said to have transmitted the oral version alone, on the basis of which, some 20 years after his death, a full copy was produced on parchment. Both Moses and Muhammad supposedly taught the correct recitation of the text, the hat'ama or the tajweed, that is so central in the ritual public reading in both traditions. Now, this public reading differs in various ways, with a topic I've dealt with previously, orally and in 2 written articles, if any of you is interested. In the medieval Middle East, the production of copies of the Torah and Qur'an was performed by amateur, semi-professional, and professional copyists. The procedure was not secret. It was not accompanied by the king and the priests, or their parallels in the Jewish and Muslim tradition, but it was certainly ritualized and supervised closely by the religious law. Religious law also shaped the handling of the completed object. And there's a very detailed etiquette regarding the treatment of the object, both of the Torah, especially of the Torah scroll, and to a lesser extent of the codex, the Mus'haf of the Torah, and the Mus'haf, the codex of the Qur'an. The privileged status of the Torah scroll, a ritual object in the very fullest and most public manner, was constructed and buttressed by a set of detailed rules of conduct pertaining to all stages of its life and all its functions, from the preparation of the specific parchment intended to carry the word of God to the disposal of the worn-out copy. To a lesser extent, this was also true for the handwritten codex of the 5 books and of the Qur'an. And I will end. Just a minute. Let me end with 2 more pictures. Seem to have closed my very last, sorry. Let me move to the right. So for anyone familiar with Jewish synagogue worship, this is of course a contemporary picture of the Torah scroll as a ritual object in the before its actual reading, and the codex of the Qur'an, symbolically on Kursi al-Qur'an, on the little support that is intended to secure its purity, cleanliness, and elevated status, right? You never put it on the floor or beneath a pile of books. And the codex of the Torah, which is vocalized and with the vocalization and commentary, which preserve the oral tradition of its recitation, but is not used as a ritual object in the same manner as is the scroll, produced to the detail according to the ancient prescriptions of the Talmud, summarized by Maimonides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniella. Normally, a moderator or a chairperson would try and tie up the papers, but I am not going to do that because we have only limited time for questions, and I think there are questions that want to be asked. So I urge you either to raise your hand and ask questions, or I can turn to Brandon Wheeler, who already put a few questions in the chat and made some comments that he can make about all 3 out of the 4 lectures. So please, if you raise your hand, I hope I can see you.
And I'm happy to let other people ask their questions.
But go for it. Go for it.
Well, I already wrote them to the people, so they can respond to them if they want, or they can just write to me later. But other people might have questions.
Okay. Yes, Daphne, please. You're muted. Can't hear you. We can't hear you, Daphne.
Effie, there's also a question from Lawrence.
Okay.
You see it in the chat.
Okay.
If you want, I can react to the question.
Yeah, please do. Please do, Dotan.
Okay. Yeah, just read. He asked, you can see the question in the chat. Were ancient copies of the Holy Script venerable because of their age or because, okay. So no, it not depends on the age. For example, I shared with you that Maimonides referred to the Aleppo Codex, the most accurate, but it was written only how much 200 years before him, not so early. He, for example, in Mishneh Torah, he cited from Talmud Bavli on vellum that in his impression were from 500 years ago. And the Aleppo Codex is not so old. So it's a question of accuracy. But of course, there is a connection. If something is very old, the attitude, the conception is as more it is old, it close to the source, to the ur text. So it has to be more accurate.
Daniella, do you want to refer to that as well? It was a question for you and to Dotan.
Yes, I was just reading the question. Yes, Bran correctly mentioned that Maimonides refers differently to a book written by a heretic, which must be burnt, in contrast to a book written by a Samaritan, a converted Jew, or a slave, a woman, or a minor, which may be discarded, like put to a gniza rather than burnt. Why is the book written by a heretic treated differently? Why must it be burnt? There's somewhere that a heretic leaves nothing behind him. I'm not sure how Dotan or Effie, maybe you can help me with the shelo yishaer lo shem, right? Yeah. So like that he will be totally forgotten. So
like Ira Nidachat.
Yeah, and to the extent that right, exactly. And to the extent that even if he is called, his offsprings are called to the Torah, they're not called to the Torah with his name, but rather with their own name, not referring to him because he has to be completely forgotten.
Completely, yes, and no work of his...
Right, eradicated.
Yeah,
it's similar to the law that Ira Nidachat, a city that its people worship idols, etc. You burn all the city with the Torah scrolls.
Mm-hmm. So this is extreme, right? This is startling, and I'm sure I don't know if it was actually done, right? But I'm sure that the people who saw Caliph Uthman burning the Qur'ans that were supposedly deviating from the canonical version, according to this perhaps mythology of the production of the Qur'an, were probably shocked as well. So I think this says something about the danger of the infidel, rather to any inherent. It says more about the attitude towards the infidel than the attitude towards the production of the scroll of the Torah. And I think you had another question or comment. Brandon, would you remind me?
I think in what I wrote, I simply I think I was asking you had said that when Moses produced the 13 Torah copies, that it wasn't in order to preserve the correctness or accuracy of the text, but the actual performance of the commands that were in the text. And so I thought maybe that was a way of understanding why the text of the heretic had to be burnt, because
that he may have inserted something that wasn't there, perhaps.
Well,
yes.
Maybe his text is perfect, but he's not acting according to the text. So the text, if it embodies his outward behavior, is a representation or a symbol of it, needs to be destroyed. Whereas those other categories of people might actually not produce an accurate text, but we still don't burn them. We just hide them because they're unfit for use.
Perhaps, but we haven't seen in the etiquette, either the Jewish or the Muslim, an explicit demand that the copyist be a good Muslim or a good Jew. Right? This is it doesn't say so anywhere that he must be, even though we have different halachic and shari discussions asking whether the performer of certain obligations must be must be a pure, not only rich. Yes, I'm not speaking of ritual purity, but morally pure or morally fit. As far as I know, there is no such demand.
Daphna, please open your mic. We can't hear you, so you have to unmute yourself first.
Okay, this is just a general observation of all these wonderful talks, which I really enjoyed and learned a lot. Daniella, I will refer to you for this remark, build on your observation, for a more general observation, being a historian who studies this text, and try to and encourage every one of us who are dealing with text and history to see how they echo or reflect trends, more general historical trends. Why the Middle East? What do we mean by medieval Middle East? Many of these texts don't refer to the Middle East, and how were they understood, received, practiced? I mean, there is a line of research that is seen here, but I think it should be, I don't want to say should, it's very recommendable or whatever. I think for all of us to pursue it and to tie history to these literary products. That's all. For instance, in your book, in both books, you're talking about the age of piety. How does this come with the text you're studying, the age of piety, the reflection of the age of piety in Syria, the Ayyubid and Mamluk period, Zangid and Mamluk period? Something of the context is missing here, of the link between the text and the context, or the contextualization in the broader meaning of the word. What happened then?
Okay, let me answer briefly, and perhaps others want to refer to it. In a way, it's tricky to contextualize a text such as the Maimonides' Sefer Ilchot Ktivat Sefer Torah, how to write a Torah scroll, in his specific historical time, knowing that there are layers of earlier texts upon which it is built. So there are at least two dimensions to text. They speak to to the society in which they are written, but they're also in dialogue with earlier texts, with a long tradition of ancient texts. Right. And so I agree with you that both things should be done. And as I said earlier, I'm very much for contextualization. And if you want contextualization, I think that the process, that the changing, perhaps appearance of the Qur'an, which I referred to, should be seen on the context of economic and, let's say, changes in technology and economic, which are also very significant when we're talking about material objects, right? So the invention of the codex already in the 1st century, the production of paper in the Middle East since the 7th or 8th century, the invention or the development of new scripts, of new pens and new inks, all those influence greatly the means of production, and also I think the way people thought about the object itself. So it's not, I'm not sure we should, it's not only in the context we are used to thinking of, like the context of religious ideas and piety, but also grounded in developments in the material world.
Yeah, okay. This is a very nice combination, I think. The piety and religious atmosphere and this dynamic in the material world. This is, I think, the benefit of the material turn that can contribute.
I'd like to read a question from the chat and add to it something. Yoni asks Stefan, considering the use of Quranic phrases on coins, were any rituals involved in minting the coins as well? Were acts of consecration, ritualization of the coins involved as well? And I want to dovetail on this question and ask also Annelise, you mentioned in your talk certain animals, and is there any reference to animals and special parchments and special animal skins that are the right material to write a Qur'an upon? And are these in correlation with the animals that are right for sacrifice? Because in Judaism, this is of course very, very strongly tied, right? You may only produce a Torah scroll on the hide of an animal that is also worthy of sacrifice, and of course not on the hide of an animal that is considered to be an abomination, like pigskin. So also to Stefan and to Annelise, if you can answer both these questions. Thank you.
So I will answer first. So surprisingly, no, there is no ritual involved as far as we know. There's although there were at the beginning for having coins with Quranic inscription objections, but these objections were reduced then. Please don't touch it when you are impure. And have a wudu before. That's all. Otherwise, not even the Nazir who supervises a mint has any ritual duties for that. It was purely a secular industrial operation to produce the coins with the Quranic inscriptions.
So we don't know of any coins as well that were like sort of reminted because they had mistakes on the Quranic inscription, etc. We don't have any examples of that, for example, right?
Obviously not. So we don't know about this, but there are sometimes a mistake where you think Allah. This is quite heretic. So there is no deity, there is no God. But just a little aleph was missing in the whole operation, these coins slipped the attention, obviously, of the supervisor. So it is just a printing operation and nothing holy with it. It is different from what you make with the coins. When you see that there is a Surat al-Ikhlas or a Surat al-Kursi on it, you might use it as a talisman, as a jewelry, whatever. But very secular, very industrial. Sometimes we have quality control, but not always, as the products show.
And I guess I can add almost the same about Quranic manuscripts. I'm not aware, but maybe Brandon Wheeler knows better. I'm not aware that they used sacrificial animals for producing the codices, which wouldn't make even much sense since the production wasn't in Mecca, but the only place where you would have probably the sacrificed animals would be in Mecca. So I'm just aware of notes of how many sheeps you need to produce one codex, and it was very expensive because there were many sheeps you needed. And since I'm already talking, I just wanted to add to Brandon Wheeler's question. Thank you so much about the garlands. Honestly, I didn't come across any mentioning of the exact material of the garlands, but I have to admit that it's just really a preliminary study, and I just looked into Tafsir, and they didn't say anything about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, we all know it's pretty common, even in ancient Greece, for the animals to be garlanded when they're going to be sacrificed. And I just noticed that the Muslim practice of marking the camel, it has to be the camel, right? Because the spear has to go into its hump, and you can't do that with a cow or a sheep. And I noticed that in all the accounts where the description was of marking the camel for sacrifice, that when a garland was mentioned, it was always like a piece of leather or leather sandals or something put around the animal's neck. And it would seem strange that pilgrims would be wearing garlands of leather sandals, where I can imagine them in pre-Islamic times wearing the leaves and the wool from these sacred trees, like the al-Uzza's trees and stuff like that. So thank you. If you do come across anybody wearing the leather garlands, let me know. I'd love to hear about that. Thanks.
Folks, since we're already way over time, I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank those who participated in the conversation. And again, thank you for a fabulous day. We're reconvening tomorrow, right, Daniella?
At 3.
3 o'clock Israel time.
Israel time, yes.
Okay.
Yes, of course.
All right. So thank you all.
And it's the same link, FYI. So it's the same Zoom link. We're not. Yeah.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, thanks very much, Effie. Thanks, everyone. If anyone wants to stay and chat a bit, please feel welcome to do so.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yoni, I had a